Hey everyone, and welcome to another one of my weekly art videos. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. Chances are that if you've been checking out my classes and tutorials for any amount of time, you're probably already well aware that most of the time when I am creating a drawing or a painting, I am stemming loosely from a reference photo or something that I have in front of me in real life. Through having something to observe as you're working, you're able to have these important pieces of information that maybe you would have otherwise forgotten that you can choose whether to bring in or not. For example, for myself, I want a certain level of realism in my work. And through having something that I'm observing, I'm able to get these pieces of visual information that I can make sure to bring in for that level of realism that I'm trying to create. This said, as I explained in an old video of mine titled "Artists Don't Copy Your Reference Photos," I explain how important it is for artists to really bring themselves into their drawings and their paintings, to make decisions and choices in terms of composition, and in order to really use the elements and principles of art to communicate the mood, message, idea, or story that they're wanting to communicate. So it's not just about taking a reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you and trying to copy it as is. It's about bringing yourself into your work, bringing in your knowledge of composition and the fundamentals, and thinking about what it is that you want to communicate so that you can manipulate the elements and principles of art to your liking. And I know that for a lot of us, when we're just getting started, it can be very difficult to break away from that very literal way of drawing and painting subjects. And so this is the main reason why I wanted to share today's thumbnail exercises with you. These are a very powerful way that you can start practicing changing colors in a composition to your liking and to express whatever idea or mood or message you're wanting to express. So what I'm going to be taking you through is how I create thumbnail color explorations using these tried and true color schemes that have been used by artists throughout history to create harmony, integration, and a level of expression in their work. I'm going to be explaining how to change those colors that we're observing in the reference photo and how to bring in bold, expressive use of color through using these color schemes and the color wheel. I'm going to be exploring 4 color schemes today, which are the analogous color scheme, the complementary color scheme, the triad, and the square. All right, without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. I wanted to share the reference photo that I'm going to be using as loose inspiration for these thumbnail color scheme explorations. This one was taken by photographer Gareth Paul. The reason why I chose this photo is because I like the arrangement of elements in this piece, how they're overlapping. I can really tell that the photographer knew what he was doing in terms of creating a visually pleasing, asymmetrically balanced composition. And also, I have a number of different elements or areas that I can explore when it comes to adding in my different colors in my color schemes. I have a background, I have a table, I have a fabric or a tablecloth, I have a flower, and I have a picture. I'll make sure to leave a link to this photo down below in the description box in case you'd like to grab it for yourself and work alongside me. The first thing that I do is create my pencil sketches. And this isn't necessarily a sketching tutorial, so I won't be going super in depth into what I am doing here, but I do have a ton of drawing tutorials that you can check out where I explain about my drawing process and how I start with a general block-in of those largest shapes simplified into blocky angular shapes, and then how I move on to refining those shapes and separating out those larger shapes into medium-sized shapes, and then finally how I add in those smallest shapes and details, always working from general towards specific or large to small, simplifying everything into simple shapes or forms, and also making sure that I am drawing very lightly in the beginning so that I can easily refine my drawing, erase mistakes as I go, and also so that I don't scratch or damage my paper. As you can see, I have separated out this 9 by 12 inch watercolor sheet into 4 spaces. And this is because I wanted to explore 4 different color schemes. I created vertical rectangles in a similar format to that reference photo that I'm going to be viewing. You don't want to be working in squares when you're observing a rectangular reference photo, or you don't want to be working in a vertical rectangle when your reference photo is a horizontal rectangle. You want to be, as much as possible, working in a drawing space that is close to the image that you're observing in terms of format or proportions. Otherwise, you're going to be making the freehand sketching process much harder for yourself. And what I am doing in each of these spaces is I am creating a quick outline sketch of these elements present in that reference photo. My aim here is just to get in those most important shapes and details so that I can then move on to the pen and ink process, and later to adding in those quick washes of color with watercolor. For me, drawing and sketching is incredibly important alongside continuing to develop my painting skills. So whenever I have the opportunity to practice my sketching, this is a great thing. And what I am doing here are just quick sketches. These are thumbnails. They're not meant to be super perfect. I am not adding in every single detail. Thumbnails are meant to be quick, imperfect, rough sketches or paintings, and they're intended to help us move on to larger pieces with a better plan, with a strategy, or simply with more practice in order to create a more successful finalized piece. Of course, at any point in time, you can create thumbnails in your sketchbook as personal studies or exploration work. So as a way to practice color schemes or to practice developing a wide range of values in your compositions, or to practice texture techniques, or whatever it is really that you feel compelled to study and explore. Okay, so going back to my sketching process and what you're seeing me do here, the way that I draw one thing is the way that I draw everything. And in my opinion, what someone should learn to do if they're trying to learn to draw is to learn the fundamentals and learn the process and learn the skills that are going to help you draw anything. If you practice building up your observational skills, your visual measuring skills, you build up your ability to recreate proportions effectively. You also understand about fundamentals such as 3D form, perspective, light behavior, etc. And you learn to simplify and work large to small. Then those skills are going to allow you to draw pretty much anything. Of course, there are certain subjects that require a deeper understanding of specific fundamentals, such as when we're trying to get good at drawing faces or drawing the human figure. Well, that requires a much deeper understanding of specific proportions and the structure of the human head and body and little anatomical elements that are going to help add realism to your pieces. However, those basic drawing skills and that basic process is still the same. You still work large to small, you're still simplifying everything into basic shapes or forms, and you still want to start your drawing lightly so that everything can be kept flexible and malleable as you continue refining your drawing. So I finished with that general block in all of these, and now you can see me going in and refining my shapes a little bit more and adding a little bit more detail via medium-sized shapes and smaller shapes. I'm just taking the main essence of what I'm observing in that reference photo and loosely getting the important things in. I have a full tutorial where I take you step by step through my process for drawing fabric, how I create that preliminary outline sketch, and all the way through to shading the fabric and developing that wide range of values, lightest lights, midtones, darkest darks, using different drawing pencil grades. I'm going to make sure to leave a link to that down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check it out. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is because in that tutorial I share how I observe the main lines and shapes created by the fabric folds, and that is what I am sketching in right now as I am creating these quick sketches. I'm noticing the value changes throughout that fabric where I see darker shadow shapes. That tells me where I should be creating a shape or a line in my sketch. I'm leaving out a lot of little details and I'm just adding in the main lines and shapes created by some of the fabric folds, the major ones present in the photo. When it comes to the flower, I already had that general block in for the entirety of that petal area or section. And then what I did for the second step in the flower, I created a smaller shape that was the middle section of the flower. And what I'm going to be doing next is actually drawing in the petals in between the smaller shape and the larger shape. Because all of the petals are coming out from the middle section of the flower, it's a lot easier for me to get them positioned around that shape so that they look like they're growing out of it. And also because I have already that larger shape drawn in, there is no guesswork involved in terms of how large I should be making those petals. And when it comes to the picture, because of the qualities of this man-made object, there is more of an understanding of 3D form and perspective when drawing something like this. I have a video in which I talk about the difference between drawing man-made objects versus organic objects, which I highly recommend checking out. I'll leave a link to it down below. But it is important that when you draw something like this, if there is a level of symmetry involved, that the thing itself looks symmetrical in your drawing. And also in this case, there is that upper section where we're able to see into the picture, and that has to make sense as well. This is a compound structure made up of a combination of different 3D forms, and that upper section where the opening is kind of cylindrical. It does have that spout to it, but if I were to simplify that into a basic form, it's a cylinder. So the upper part needs to have an ellipse or an oval, and that ellipse or oval is going to be more open or less open depending on our vantage point in relation to the object itself. So it has to do with perspective, but it is important to notice how open or how closed or squished that ellipse at the top is, so that you can have that perspective looking right. The handle is something that can be challenging as well, how it twists. We have to notice the planes that we're able to see in that reference photo. Notice how those planes change throughout that visible portion of the handle. How that upper plane turns into a side plane, then a bottom plane, and how the inner planes are also shifting and changing. You'll see this happen in coffee mugs or teacups and anything that has a handle like this. And something that you can do to practice is just place a coffee mug in front of you and practice sketching that. Okay, so it is now time to move on to the pen and ink process. Now, because I'm going to be bringing in watercolor, it is essential that I use a pen that contains waterproof or smudge-proof ink. I really like Staedtler pigment liners. That's something that maybe if you've seen any of my pen and ink tutorials, you've seen me use in the past. I also like Micron pens from Sakura. That's another good brand that you can use with watercolor with no issues. And what I am using today is a Unipin fine liner. This one is from Mitsubishi Pencil Co. and it has water and fade proof pigment ink. I decided to go with a pen tip that is 0.5 in size for these, and I am going in nice and quick. I'm not spending too long in any single section of the drawing, and what I am doing is I am tracing over my pencil work. I am making sure to move nice and quick. I'm not spending too long in any single section or element, and I am keeping my hand and arm moving. This is going to help me create more dynamic, interesting looking lines that have a line weight variation to them. What I am trying to stay away from is stiffness, and also I'm trying to stay away from a consistent, thick, very flat, dark looking outline around all of these different elements. I'm trying to stay away from that cartoony or coloring book page kind of look where you have a very thick, dark outline around all of my elements, because that leads to a very flat look. Instead, I am doing my line work in sections. I'm leaving certain parts where these lines are not even connecting. And as I said, I'm keeping it moving, which allows me to create more expressive lines and helps me create these lines where certain parts of the line are thinner and lighter and other sections of my lines are thicker and darker. If I move too slowly or I hesitate and stop as I am creating that line, that is going to lead to stiffness and even to stop and start marks throughout that line. I would much rather have an imperfect line that has slight wobbles or imperfections throughout it than a very perfect but stiff, flat looking line. And I've talked about this before, the variables that we can explore and play with when we are drawing with pen and ink that will help you develop that line weight variation that will lead to more dynamic, interesting results. I will be leaving links to those videos in which I talk more about pen and ink techniques and provide specific tips for better usage of this medium. But these 4 variables that I would highly recommend starting to explore are: number 1, the speed at which you're moving your hand and arm. If you're moving very, very slowly, that is likely going to give more time for that ink to come down the nib of your pen, and you're going to end up with thicker, darker lines. This isn't to say that thicker, darker lines are wrong, but remember that you're looking for that variation in line weights. So think of how you can shift and change these variables as you're working. Number 2, the angle at which you're using your pen also has an impact on how thick and dark that line or mark look. If your pen is more at an upright, maybe 90-degree position from the paper, more ink is going to flow down that nib as well, and you're going to end up with thicker, bolder lines. Whereas if you use more of a 25 to 30-degree angle, maybe even 45-degree angle from the page, less ink is going to be able to flow down that nib, which is going to lead to thinner, lighter lines. Maybe even broken lines. Variable number 3 would be the pressure that you're exerting on the pen itself. If you press down a little bit harder, then more ink is going to flow down that nib. Whereas if you don't press down, less ink is going to have a chance to flow down that nib. By the way, I never really press down hard at all because I don't want to scratch or damage my paper. That is something that I wouldn't be able to fix. It's just sometimes I'm barely touching the tip of my pen to my paper, and other times there is greater contact, so to speak. And finally, the 4th variable is, of course, the pen tip size itself. Larger pen tip sizes are going to lead to thicker, bolder lines, and smaller pen tip sizes are going to lead to thinner, lighter lines. But if you can shift and change the first 3 variables, you can develop a line weight variation and an interesting look even with one single pen. After I finished with my pen and ink, I allowed everything to dry for around 5 to 10 minutes, and then what I did was I erased out all of my pencil work with my soft graphite eraser, and I made sure to dust off those eraser bits with a dry towel instead of with my hand. Right here, I am picking the color schemes that I'm going to be exploring today. I decided to go with the analogous color scheme, the complementary color scheme, the triad, and the square. And I'm just labeling these with a black Sharpie before moving forward so that I don't get confused, and I can label them later for future reference after everything has dried. And finally, we are ready to get started with our watercolor washes. Just as an FYI, if you're interested, each one of these thumbnails is approximately 3.5 inches in width and 4.5 inches in length. And I'm going to be bringing in 3 different watercolor paintbrushes. One of them is a flat brush that is 3/4 of an inch in size, and the other 2 are round brushes. One of them is a size 10 round and the other one is a size 3. I'm just going to be switching between them depending on the size of the element or area that I'm going to be painting in. All of these are quick little paintings. I'm not going for super high levels of detail or very realistic shading. I'm painting these pretty quick. Okay, so the first color scheme that we're going to be exploring is the analogous color scheme. Right here in this graphic, you can see how the analogous color scheme is made up of groups of 3 colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. So for this first thumbnail, I want you to pick out any 3 colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. For this one, I think it's helpful to consider whether you prefer warmer colors or cooler colors, and also give thought to the mood that you're trying to transmit through this little piece. Are you going for more of a calm vibe, a melancholic vibe, sad vibe? If so, perhaps think of choosing a group of 3 cool colors. Greens, purples, blues? Or do you want your piece to look more lively, energetic? If so, consider going with a group of warmer colors, oranges, reds, yellows. But you can also consider picking a sequence of colors that is somewhere in between the warm and cool. Like, for example, red, purple, purple, and blue, where red, purple would be the warmest of all. Or you could also do something like yellow, yellow, green, and green. I decided to go with purple, and red for this one. And you can see how I am supporting myself with my old color wheel from art school here. As I am creating my color mixtures, I am using the colors in that color wheel to help guide me, to make sure that the color that I'm creating is quite similar to the red purple, and the purple in the color wheel. And what I am doing is I am preparing my 3 color mixtures on my palette. I am creating my purple first by combining a red and a blue, and I just decide to mix together alizarin crimson for my red and ultramarine blue for my blue, and I am mixing them together until I get a purple that looks like a secondary purple to me. For my second color mixture, I need to create my red purple, so once again I mix together the same red and the same blue, only this time the color mixture has more red in it so that it looks more like a red purple. And then finally I also prepare a little puddle of red. So that's going to be plain alizarin crimson with water added in. Notice how these color mixtures on my palette are nice and juicy. They have a good amount of both paint and water in them. One thing that I do want to mention is you might want to think of neutrals that you might want to bring in these thumbnails. So blacks, grays, browns, beige, you can bring those in for certain elements or areas in these thumbnails, and by bringing in these neutrals, you won't be changing the color scheme. Of course, your neutrals will be warmer or cooler. For example, if you decide to bring in a burnt sienna, that's a reddish brown. So you would be adding warmth to that little composition. Whereas if you bring in something like a Payne's gray, this is a gray that has blue in it. So this gray is cool biased. You're going to be bringing in coolness into your little composition. So just something to give thought to. Before painting each one of my thumbnails, I take a minute to think of where I'm going to be using my different colors. And if I'm going to be bringing in a neutral, I decide if I'm going to be painting the back wall with the neutral, maybe the picture with the neutral, or the table with the neutral. For my neutrals, I'm going to be bringing in Payne's gray and also raw sienna, burnt sienna, and raw umber. I'm going to be bringing in a neutral into every single thumbnail. And as I said, it's important that before you put paintbrush to paper, that you give thought to which element or area you're going to be painting with which color. This way, you can avoid painting in 2 elements or areas that are right next to each other using the same color. However, remember that you can alter the value or the lightness to darkness of each one of your colors when you're painting with watercolor through just adding in water into your color mixture. So you could have 2 areas or elements that are the same color, only one area looks lighter because you've used that same color but it's been watered down, versus the other section right next to it is a little bit darker. You've used the color in a thicker, less watered down way. Make sure that you're altering the consistency of your paint when you're painting with watercolor depending on what it is that you're trying to do. If you want your color color to look darker, then use more paint than water in your mixtures. And if you're looking for lighter color, add more water into your mixtures. Water them down a little bit more. I like avoiding going in with very dark, super thick color mixtures right off the bat, because that leads to a lot of heaviness and flatness. And I do want to be able to see that ink pretty well through that watercolor at the end. Not to mention, even though these are quick paintings that I'm creating, it's still important to bring in the qualities of watercolor, how this is a translucent or transparent medium, and we're bringing in the brightness and the whiteness of the paper under the paint as part of the piece to help us create that glow that is so particular to watercolor. So even though these are quick thumbnails, I'm still practicing water control, and I'm trying to at least develop a little sense of dimension in what it is that I am painting by creating lighter areas and darker areas. Through sticking with a coffee to milk-like consistency, or even a tea consistency if I'm looking for light watered down color, and also through going in with just water in my paintbrush from time to time to soften that color even more, or going in and doing lifting using my clean and slightly damp paintbrush bristles as a little absorbent sponge to lift up paint off from highlight sections in these different elements. All of that helps me develop a nice range of values throughout these elements and also throughout these thumbnails as a whole. If I go in super thick and dark since the beginning, I am going to get rid of my ability to develop those lighter value sections, which are so important if I want something to look like it has dimension to it. And simultaneously, I'm going to be covering up way too much of that paper, which is going to lead to heavier results. And that's not really something that we're looking for when we're painting with watercolor. We want to play with the medium's translucency. This will help us create fresh results that have a glow to them. Another thing that is important to mention is if you don't want any bleeding to happen or colors merging together, it's going to be important that you strategically jump around your thumbnail as you're painting your different sections or elements in order to avoid painting in an area or a shape that is right beside a shape that is still wet. Because if you do that, if you go in and paint in an area while that previous section that is right beside it is still wet, then those two colors that you've used in these two different areas or shapes are going to start merging or bleeding into each other. And in some cases, you might be actually wanting to do this intentionally. A lot of artists use bleeding intentionally, and it does lead to very beautiful organic effects. But if you don't want this bleeding to happen, then just make sure that you are allowing that section to dry completely before painting in a section that is right next to it. So I'm almost done with this first thumbnail. You can see me going in with my smallest paintbrush, my size 3, and I'm doing some layering of paint, painting on some darker shadow shapes that I'm able to see in the reference photo. I am just going to be using 2 layers in all of these thumbnails. I'm going to be painting the first layer everywhere pretty quickly, and then I'm going to allow everything to dry, and then I'm going to go in to paint in some abstract, irregular shadow shapes just for a little bit more contrast and detail and a greater variety of values. And because I still hadn't decided what neutral I would be using for the background, and I wanted to make sure that everything was completely dry before I painted in the background, I got started with my work on the complementary scheme thumbnail, and later on I'm going to go back to my first thumbnail to paint in my background. So a complementary color scheme is made up of 2 colors that are direct opposites in the color wheel. So what I want you to do for this one is pick any pair of 2 colors that are opposite to each other in the color wheel. I decide to go with blue and orange. The blue that I am using is Antwerp blue, and my orange is a mixture of New Gamboge plus a teeny tiny bit of Pyrrole red. Once again, I am supporting myself with my color wheel to check on those colors, and whenever it is that I am mixing 2 colors together, I make sure that the color that I am creating is very close to what I am seeing in that color wheel. In this case, for example, I am going for a secondary orange. I don't want it to look too much like a yellow orange or a red orange. Okay, so I'm going to swatch out these two colors for you, and then I'm going to be moving on to painting the next thumbnail. I go ahead and get started with the little flower. For some reason, I start with the flower with all of these, but everything else is kind of painted in a different order. I use my smaller brush, my size 3 for that, but then I switch on over to my flat brush to paint in the background wash. I decide to go with blue for my background, and for this one, I'm going to be bringing in a neutral, a light brown, to paint in the picture. It's so important to load up your paintbrush bristles well and paint quickly whenever it is that you're going to be painting in a relatively large area, such as the background for this one, especially because we're painting on dry paper, and dry paper is thirsty paper, so everything starts drying pretty quick. If you go in to try to paint these larger sections with a brush that is too small, or you're doing it too slowly, you're very likely to arrive at lots of texture and lines and marks throughout that background. After painting in the larger portion of the background in all of these, you're going to notice how I switch on over to my smallest round brush to paint in that negative shape inside of the picture handle. Right here I am creating a mixture of raw sienna and a little bit of burnt sienna, warm it up a little bit more with the reddish brown, and this is the neutral that I'm going to be using to paint in the picture. And I'm going to make sure to do the same for all of these that I was talking about before. I don't want to go in super dark right away. I want to develop at least a slight range of values everywhere throughout the little thumbnail to create a sense of dimension and light, so I don't go in super thick with my consistencies right off the bat. And I also use my paintbrush to do some lifting in highlight sections where the light is hitting the picture, for example. I go in with a clean and slightly damp brush to lift up some excess color to reveal some of that paper under the paint. I make sure to do that while that paint is still wet so that I can go in and soak it back up. Something that's important to have in mind when it comes to using complementary colors in paintings, or simply colors that are very different from each other, you want to avoid going in and over blending, because if complementary colors mix together, they're going to mute each other down. So unless you're looking for muted colors, I would recommend keeping complementary colors or even warm and cool colors separate and organized on your palette so that these color mixtures on your palette don't start seeping into each other. And also make sure that you're being careful with the mixing or blending that might happen with complementary colors or warm and cool colors while on your watercolor sheet. Because right now I'm not looking for muted colors and I want these colors to be nice and bright, I am making sure to drop in my colors or paint in my colors wherever it is that I want them in this little composition, and I am avoiding going in afterward and moving around that paint or blending colors together after I've placed them on my paper. If you mix together a good amount of blue and orange, you're gonna get a brown. On the other hand, if analogous colors start mixing together, you're not going to arrive at desaturated colors. When you mix analogous colors together, or colors that are right next to each other in the color wheel, those mixtures are always going to be bright and vibrant. I have another full tutorial video where I explain different methods for shading, and I show you how to shade using complementary colors, using analogous colors, etc., which I highly recommend checking out if you haven't already, because you can use both complementary colors and analogous colors for shading depending on whether you're going for more muted results or more vibrant results. Both are excellent options, and it depends on what you like. All right, so as you can see, I painted in the fabric in blue as well. And just so that I could tell it apart from the background, I made sure to use the blue in the fabric in a more watered down state so that overall it would look lighter than the blue background. I painted in the table with my orange. And what I am doing right now is I am starting to paint in some darker shadow shapes. The picture is still pretty wet and my shadow shapes are becoming more blurred than what I wanted them to be because the paint is expanding out on that wet paper. So I'm going to allow that to dry and I'll come back to paint in those shadow shapes later once again. I'm painting in those shadow shapes in the fabric and I'm also going to paint in small shadow shapes also along the bottom edge of the fabric where I see some shadows in that reference photo as well. Alright, so while I allow that second thumbnail to dry in order to go in to paint in more shadow shapes, I'm going to take a quick second to create some gray in order to paint in the background wall in my first thumbnail. By this point, everything in the first thumbnail is completely dry. I create a watered down Payne's gray mixture on my palette and I use my flat brush in order to paint in this background wall section. I made sure to water down the Payne's gray and paint in that background wall color with a pretty light gray because I was afraid that if I went in with a darker gray, the picture would get lost in that background. In the meantime, my complementary color scheme thumbnail had dried, so I was able to go in and reinforce some shadow shapes. I make more of my raw sienna plus burnt sienna mixture, which is the color mixture that I was using in the picture, and I just go in to push those darker shadow shapes a little bit more. And I also go ahead and darken some shadow shapes under the fabric. Moving on to the triad thumbnail. A triad or triadic color schemes are color schemes composed of groups of 3 colors that form an equilateral triangle in the color wheel. An equilateral triangle is simply a triangle that has 3 equal sides or sides that have the same length. So for example, the 3 primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, the way that they are positioned in the color wheel creates an equilateral triangle. In other words, red, yellow, and blue, or the 3 primaries, would be an example of a triadic color scheme. So for this one, I want you to pick a group of any 3 colors in the color wheel that are separated by 3 colors in between each, or that would create an equilateral triangle in the color wheel. The colors I decide to go with are blue-green, red-purple, and yellow-orange. For my blue-green, I mix together phthalo blue and viridian green. I add in more of one color or the other into my color mixture until I arrive at a blue-green that is similar to the blue-green that I see in my color wheel. For my red-purple, I mix together alizarin crimson and a little bit of phthalo blue. And finally, for my yellow-orange, I just use plain New Gamboge with some water added in. New Gamboge is a warm yellow, so it is a yellow that is already leaning more towards the orange because it has a teeny tiny bit of red in it. So I use it on its own. Once I have a good amount of my different color mixtures ready on my palette and the consistency of these 3 different color mixtures is good, nice and juicy with a good amount of both paint and water in them, I go ahead and get started with the painting process. Once again, starting with the flower with my smallest brush. I like how it's looking when I paint in the petals and then drop in that color for the central section of the flower while those petals are still wet because I get that bleeding happening that I was talking about before. I think that looks nice for the flower. So I'm using that bleeding in that element intentionally. And then I switch on over to my size 10 round brush and start painting in other elements and sections. Notice how right here I start painting in that picture with my blue-green. I paint in some color and then I go into my container of water with my paintbrush and I go in with more water in my paintbrush to soften that color. Whenever I feel I'm going in with way too much color right off the bat, I remove some of that color from my paintbrush bristles and go in with just a little bit of water in my brush. This goes back to what I was mentioning before in terms of making sure that I'm not going in super thick and dark right off the bat, and making sure that I'm incorporating some lighter sections. Right here you can see me using the clean and slightly damp bristles of my brush as a little absorbent sponge to remove some paint from highlight areas. For these last two thumbnails, I'm going to be a little bit more experimental when it comes to how I use my color and create bleeds and even blooms. So for example, right here, you can see how I am using red purple in that blue-green picture for my shadow areas. There is also a little bleeding that happened in the bottom right of the picture where the blue-green of the picture meets the yellow-orange in the fabric, and I just let that bleed happen. I think it looks quite nice. The neutral that I decide to go with for this one is the reddish brown that I was using before in my previous thumbnail. And for this one, I use that neutral for the table. And then finally, I decide to paint in the background with a very light red purple. I make sure to water down that color mixture. I bring out a little bit more water from my container, mix it into that color mixture, and use my flat brush to quickly paint in that background color. I'm going to go through the same process that I've been using so far, where I paint in that first layer everywhere, and then afterward I go in with my smaller brush to paint in some abstract irregular shadow shapes. When I paint in these shadow shapes on dry paper, of course I'm going to be left with sharp defined edges around them. So whenever it is that I want to go in and soften an edge, I simply remove that color from my paintbrush bristles and I run the clean and slightly damp bristles of my paintbrush over that edge that I'm looking to soften. Okay, and finally it's time for our fourth thumbnail. And for this one, we're going to be using a square color scheme, which is just like it sounds. We're going to be choosing a group of 4 colors, which are sitting in a square positioning in the color wheel. So they're separated by 2 colors in between. This is probably going to be the most colorful one of all because we're bringing in 4 different colors. Whereas with the others, where we're just bringing in 2 or 3 different colors, plus of course whatever neutral it is that you decided to bring in. So maybe for this one you decide to not even bring in a neutral at all. It's up to you. But whatever the case may be, for this one you're going to go ahead and choose a group of 4 different colors that are sitting in a square positioning in the color wheel. For this one I chose to go with green, yellow orange, red, and blue purple. That's going to be my group of 4 colors for my square scheme. So I'm going to get started with creating my color mixtures on my palette that I need. For my secondary green, I mixed together phthalo blue and Windsor lemon. I once again continue mixing in more of my yellow or my green until I arrive at a green that looks like a secondary green. For my blue purple, I mixed together ultramarine blue and a teeny tiny bit of alizarin crimson. The red that I use is simply Pyrrole red with some water added in. And finally, my yellow-orange is once again just plain New Gamboge, which is a warm yellow. And with that, it's time to get started with my final little thumbnail painting. I start again with the flower and my smallest brush. I decide to paint the flower with the red. I drop in a little bit of that yellow-orange in the center of the flower while the petals are still wet in order to have a little bloom or bleed happen in that central section. Then I switch on over to my larger size 10 round brush and start painting in other elements. I have all of the previous things that I have shared with you still in mind as I am working through this. Only with this one, I am going to be a little bit more experimental. I'm going to be creating some blooms both in the picture and in the background wall by dropping in a very different color over that first color while that first layer is still wet. Right here, for example, you can see me dropping in some of my yellow-orange over that blue-purple in some little sections. I am making sure not to do any blending after I've dropped in that second color, because if I do, since yellow and purple are opposites in the color wheel, I can run the risk of creating muddiness or desaturated colors, and I'm not looking for that right now. I also made sure to completely remove the previous color from my paintbrush bristles before going into the next, when I was creating that colorful bloom. So I made sure to completely remove the purple from my bristles before going into the yellow. And another little tip that I can provide that can help you stay away from muddiness or from accidentally desaturating or muting your colors down is keep an eye on your water in your container or containers. If you're using more than one, make sure that you're using clean water. As soon as your water starts becoming murky, make sure to change your water, because if it's dirty, it can also affect how bright your colors look. Okay, so I decided to use green in my background wall. I painted in that green nice and quick with my flat brush, and while that green was still wet, I switched on over to my size 10 round brush and I dropped in some of my yellow-orange. I made sure to just drop in my color and allowed that paint to do its thing. I'm going to paint in some shadow shapes in the fabric while everything else is drying. And the neutral that I decided to go with for this one is once again my gray. This time I'm going to be using my Payne's gray in a less watered down state so that the table looks darker. I thought it was a good choice to bring in a darker version of my gray for this one because of how light the fabric is over that table. It creates a nice level of contrast. Whereas if the fabric were darker, and I painted the surface of the table dark as well, there wouldn't be as much contrast created between the surface of the table and the fabric on the table. And depending on the colors and the values of those colors that you have used, the fabric can even get lost with that surface, and I didn't want that. So as I am choosing the colors that I'm going to be using for my different areas or elements, and also as I modify the consistencies or the paint to water ratios of my color mixtures on my palette, I'm always giving thought to the level of contrast that I'll be creating. Okay, so I'm just finishing up here with some shadow shapes in my different elements, and I'm going to call these done. Okay, so with that, we're all done with these color scheme explorations. In order to get the most out of this exercise, I want to encourage you to actually reflect on the outcome of all of these thumbnails. Compare them with each other. Notice the differences between them in terms of level of contrast, in terms of how colorful some of them look and how others look less colorful. Also notice the difference between using gray or black as a neutral versus using brown as a neutral. Notice the difference between the thumbnails where you've used mostly warm colors versus thumbnails where you've used mostly cool colors. First, notice the objective, specific differences between them, And then once you have come to those objective observations, come to a conclusion in terms of what you like most, what you're drawn to most, and think about why this is. This kind of exercise and taking time to reflect on this kind of stuff is going to help you understand more of what you like as an artist, which is going to help you develop your own art style and voice. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited. They are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.